Afghanistan has earned the grim nickname Graveyard of Empires for good reason. Two superpowers learned this lesson the hard way, spending decades trying to reshape this mountainous nation according to their ideologies, only to retreat in defeat. How both the Soviet Union and the United States stumbled into the same trap. The Soviets didn't wake up one morning and decide to invade Afghanistan. The country was already sliding into chaos after a communist coup in 1978 brought the People's Democratic Party to power. The new government, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki and later Hafizullah Amin, tried to rapidly modernize Afghanistan through brutal reforms that directly challenged traditional Islamic and tribal customs. Moscow watched nervously as their communist allies struggled against growing resistance. When President Amin started making overtures to the West and appeared increasingly unreliable, the Kremlin decided to act. On Christmas Eve 1979, Soviet forces crossed the border, killed Amin, and installed Babrak Karmal as their puppet leader.
The official justification was helping a fellow socialist state against foreign-backed insurgents. The real reason was geopolitical paranoia. The Soviets feared losing influence in their southern backyard, especially with Iran in revolution and the Cold War heating up. They thought a quick intervention would stabilize the situation within months. They were spectacularly wrong. The Soviet military was designed to fight NATO in European plains, not guerrillas in Afghan mountains. The Mujahideen used hit-and-run tactics that neutralized Soviet advantages in heavy armor and air power. Every village could hide fighters. Every mountain pass could become an ambush point. But the deeper problem was ideological. The Soviets tried to impose atheistic communism on a deeply religious society. Their puppet government promoted women's rights, secular education, and land redistribution, policies that might sound progressive, but were seen as foreign attacks on Islamic tradition. When Soviet advisors told rural Afghans to abandon their faith and tribal customs, they created enemies out of neutral populations. The resistance gained momentum when the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia began funneling weapons and money to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's intelligence service. The introduction of American Stinger missiles in the mid-1980s made Soviet helicopters vulnerable, forcing them to rely more on ground forces that were even easier targets. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev realized the war was bleeding the USSR dry. The Soviet economy couldn't sustain a prolonged conflict while trying to compete with Reagan's military buildup. After 9 years, 15,000 Soviet deaths, and massive financial costs, the Red Army withdrew in February 1989, leaving behind a puppet government that collapsed within 3 years. The American invasion had a different origin story, but followed a similar arc. After 9/11, the Taliban government harbored al-Qaeda and refused to hand over Osama bin Laden. Unlike the Soviets, Americans had legitimate reasons for military action and initially broad international support. The initial campaign was a masterpiece of modern warfare. Special forces working with Northern Alliance fighters and precision airstrikes toppled the Taliban in weeks, not months. By December 2001, the Taliban fled to Pakistan, al-Qaeda was scattered, and Afghanistan seemed ready for reconstruction. This is where mission creep began. What started as counterterrorism evolved into nation-building. The Bush administration decided that defeating terrorism required creating a stable, democratic Afghanistan. This meant building institutions, training security forces, and changing centuries-old social structures. The Americans fell into the same trap as the Soviets, just with different ideology. Instead of communist atheism, they promoted liberal democracy, women's rights, and free market capitalism. While these weren't inherently hostile to Islam like Soviet policies, they still represented foreign values imposed by outsiders. The initial mistake was assuming that defeating the Taliban meant winning Afghan hearts and minds. The US installed Hamid Karzai's government, which was seen as legitimate in Kabul but had little authority in rural areas where most Afghans lived.
local power remained with tribal leaders and warlords who often had their own agendas. Corruption became endemic. American aid money disappeared into Swiss bank accounts, while ordinary Afghans saw little improvement in their lives. The Afghan National Army, despite billions in training and equipment, remained unreliable. Soldiers often deserted, sold weapons to insurgents, or simply didn't show up for duty. The Taliban regrouped in Pakistan's tribal areas, launching an insurgency that exploited these weaknesses. They positioned themselves as defenders of Afghan sovereignty against foreign occupation, the same narrative that worked against the Soviets. Every civilian casualty from drone strikes or night raids created new recruits for the insurgency. Like the Soviets, Americans discovered that military superiority meant little against an enemy that could blend into the population and wait out any occupation. The Taliban didn't need to win battles, they just needed to survive longer than American public patience. Afghanistan earned its reputation because it consistently defeats conventional military thinking. The terrain favors defenders who know every mountain pass and valley. The population is fiercely independent, with loyalty structures based on tribe and clan rather than national identity. Any foreign power trying to impose control faces the same fundamental problems. Both superpowers made the classic imperial mistake of assuming their values were universal. They believed that Afghans would embrace their respective ideologies once exposed to their benefits. Instead, they discovered that political systems can't be transplanted like seeds into different soil. The irony is that both interventions created the conditions for extremist takeover. The Soviet withdrawal led to civil war and eventually Taliban rule. The American withdrawal in August 2021 led to immediate Taliban victory and the collapse of everything built over 20 years.
The Taliban's return to power has been catastrophic for ordinary Afghans, especially women. Girls are banned from schools beyond 6th grade, women can't work in most jobs, and public parks are segregated by gender. The economy has collapsed, with millions facing starvation. This humanitarian disaster is partly the legacy of failed superpower interventions. 20 years of war destroyed traditional institutions without replacing them with anything sustainable. The Taliban filled the vacuum not because they were popular, but because they were organized and ruthless. Today's Afghanistan shows what happens when great powers pursue unrealistic goals in places they don't understand. Both the USSR and USA had the military capacity to occupy Afghanistan, but neither could create lasting political change. They learned too late that conquering a country and governing it are entirely different challenges. The lesson isn't that military intervention never works, but that it requires realistic goals, deep cultural understanding, and genuine local support. Without these elements, even superpowers become just another entry in Afghanistan's long list of failed occupiers. Both empires discovered that Afghanistan doesn't just resist conquest, it consumes conquerors. The graveyard of empires claims another generation of victims, but this time it's the Afghan people themselves who pay the highest price for the world's geopolitical failures.